So, I want you to imagine something. Picture a European general standing in the blistering heat of the North African desert.
Okay.
It's the height of the imperial age, right?
Right.
And he's looking out over the sands, and he's fully expecting to just easily steamroll a population of, disorganized, impoverished nomads.
Right. I mean, that is the standard colonial playbook. You show up with a superior firepower, you claim the territory, and you exploit the resources.
Exactly. But instead of this scattered resistance, his forces just completely slam into a highly educated, economically independent, fiercely disciplined shadow state.
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking about a society operating out of fortified agricultural lodges built directly on top of ancient Greco-Roman ruins.
That is wild.
Right, complete with their own schools, civil courts, and like this intricate postal system.
I mean, that is the absolute ultimate nightmare for an invading empire.
Oh, for sure.
Because they thought they were walking into a void, right? Just a primitive blank slate they could paint their flag over.
Right.
But instead, they walked into a civilization that had essentially rewired its own internal operating system just to survive this exact kind of existential threat.
Which is fascinating because we usually think of a civilization collapsing or stagnating due to some sudden catastrophic event.
Yeah.
Like an asteroid or a massive war.
Yeah, totally.
But today, we're doing a deep dive into a different kind of crisis. We're asking, what happens when a civilization that was once the undisputed center of global knowledge and science and power, what happens when they wake up centuries later to find themselves politically fractured, economically exploited, and completely intellectually paralyzed from the inside out?
It's just a state of creeping decay, and the question becomes, how does a culture in that position pull itself out of the mud?
Right.
How do you modernize and defend yourself against aggressive foreign empires without completely abandoning your soul and your foundational identity?
And that is the exact mission of today's deep dive. We are immersing you in a really fascinating source today. We're looking at excerpts from A History of Muslim Philosophy, Volume 2.
Yes.
And we are charting the course of what the text calls the modern renaissance of the Islamic world, spanning from the 18th to the 20th centuries.
It's a huge timeline.
It is. And we're going to examine how a series of incredibly bold thinkers, guys, operating in the deserts of Arabia, the coasts of Libya, the streets of Cairo, the cafes of Paris, how they attempted to synthesize their ancient foundational texts with the, terrifying urgent demands of the modern age.
And I think the reason we're asking you, the listener, to care about this today is that the mechanics of their struggle are just profoundly relevant to the modern condition.
Well, absolutely.
Like, we are all currently living through our own version of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a relentless information overload.
Massive technological paradigm shifts, like AI.
Right, and the rapid erosion of traditional community structures. And you can't just hit pause on the modern world.
Exactly. You can't. And the figures we're examining today, they offer a masterclass in how to sift through centuries of accumulated cultural baggage to find the essential grain and discard the irrelevant chaff.
Yeah.
Because they were forced to use critical thinking,
Yeah.
not as some abstract academic exercise, but as a literal survival mechanism.
Okay, so let's start by looking at the baseline, the muddy waters from which this entire Renaissance had to emerge. We're in the 18th century.
Right.
The Ottoman Empire is technically still standing, but the picture our source paints of this era is pretty bleak. The Islamic world is in a state of profound dormancy.
Yeah, the source actually uses a very specific term for this. It calls it jahiliyyah, which translates to ignorance.
It's ignorance, okay?
But we have to understand the specific mechanism of this ignorance. Because it wasn't a lack of access to information, right? It was more of a societal sloth.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the early 1700s, according to the text, the original dynamic tenets of the faith had just been buried. They were suffocating under centuries of what the text calls alien ideas, superstitions, and incredibly convoluted, sterile interpretations.
Built up by medieval scholastic theologians.
Exactly.
It's kind of like an intricate legal system where no one actually remembers the Constitution and everyone's just arguing over a footnote of a footnote from 300 years ago.
That is a perfect analogy, yeah.
So into this specific landscape of intellectual paralysis steps a figure named Muhammad bin ʿAbd al-Wahhab.
Right.
He's born around 1700 in the Najd, which is the deep interior of the Arabian Peninsula. And he looked around at the saint worship, the mystical innovations, the sheer complacency Okay, let's unpack this because his mission is distilled down to a radically disruptive idea, which is just back to Islam.
Yeah, because he recognized that the intellectual stagnation wasn't just a theoretical problem, right? It was the root cause of their political and social weakness. He saw all these layered medieval interpretations and superstitious accretions as a kind of spiritual and intellectual rot.
It makes me think of a computer system that's just loaded with bloatware, like a software reboot is needed. The system had been bogged down by centuries of subjective deductions, and he essentially wanted to strike down 6 centuries of case law.
Right, to bypass all the subjective deductions of the later jurists.
Exactly, and return strictly to the primary source code, the Quran and the Sunnah, the original traditions.
But here is the crucial nuance that our source makes, and I think it challenges a lot of modern assumptions.
Oh.
Because he wanted to wipe away 600 years of tradition, his movement is frequently dismissed today as purely retrogressive or arch-conservative.
Right, like going backward.
But our text argues forcefully that in his historical context, this was actually a massive progressive leap forward.
Wait, really? That feels pretty counterintuitive. How is returning to an older source code considered progressive?
Because of the mechanism of how that return was achieved. So for centuries, the prevailing intellectual mode in the Arab world was a concept called taqlid.
Taqlid.
Yeah. And taqlid means the blind following of previous authorities.
Ah, gotcha.
It meant that a scholar or a judge in the 17th century was not supposed to analyze the original texts themselves.
Oh, wow.
Right. They were only supposed to apply the rulings made by scholars in the 10th or 11th centuries. The system demanded unquestioning obedience to the past.
So the analytical muscle of the entire civilization had basically completely atrophied. You weren't allowed to think for yourself. You just had to copy the answers from the back of the book.
Precisely. And Wahhab attacked taqlid head-on.
Okay.
By demanding a return to the original texts, he was simultaneously demanding that people actually read, analyze, and interpret those texts anew.
He reopened the gates of Ijtihad.
Ijtihad.
Yes, which is the practice of independent, critical reasoning. Those gates had been effectively sealed shut for 600 years.
That is insane. Yeah. So to suddenly tell a stagnant society, do not just take the word of a medieval scholar. You have a duty to use your own reason to understand the foundational texts. I mean, that was an explosive, democratizing idea.
But I mean, an idea that explosive needs infrastructure to survive, right? You can't just preach independent reasoning to nomadic tribes without teaching them how to read the text in the first place.
Exactly.
And the smallest details that Wahhab didn't just write treatises, he built a system.
Yes, he formed a strategic alliance with Mohammed bin Saud, who was a powerful clan leader in the Najd. And this is where theology meets realpolitik.
Right.
Wahhab understood that moral persuasion without political and military backing would just be crushed by the establishment. So by wedding the desert Arabs into a politico-religious unity, they created a state apparatus that could actually enforce and fund his reforms.
And the scale of the educational reform here is staggering when you consider the environment. We're talking about the deep desert in the 1700s.
Yeah.
The source notes that every single oasis they brought under their control received a maktab, a dedicated school. And his own sons were actually dispatched to run these schools, and they were funded directly by the Beit al-Mal, the public treasury.
It's a massive undertaking.
It is. They created a network of teachers capable of instructing the nomadic Bedouin not just in theology, but in basic literacy.
And the intellectual ramifications of this shift were profound. Because when you break the habit of blind following, it changes how a society values knowledge.
How so?
Well, the text points out a really fascinating pivot during this era. Prior to this, the intellectual elite had heavily favored abstract, highly speculative philosophers like al-Farabi.
Right. We've heard of him.
Yeah, and al-Farabi was brilliant, but he based his theories of the state on pure philosophical abstraction. He was highly influenced by Greek thought.
Right, so he was writing utopian theory, basically, like how things should be in a perfect world.
Exactly. But post-Wahhab, as Ijtihad and critical analysis took hold, there was a noticeable shift toward thinkers like Ibn Khaldun.
Okay, who was he?
Ibn Khaldun was an empirical scientific historian. He didn't care about utopian abstraction. He cared about the hard logic of history, the demonstrable facts of how empires rise, how they decay, and how tribal solidarity functions.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's a shift from arguing about how a state should ideally exist in a vacuum to analyzing how power and society actually function on the ground.
Yes.
And you can see how that empirical grounded mindset is absolutely necessary if you're going to survive the encroaching modern era.
It forced them to look at the hard, uncomfortable realities of their political situation, which, laid the critical groundwork for later, broader movements like pan-Islamism.
Okay, so we have this intense internal intellectual reboot happening in the isolation of the Arabian desert. They're scrubbing the system, reintroducing empirical thought, funding mass literacy. But isolated theological reform really only works when you have a geographic buffer.
Yeah.
Because while Arabia was undergoing this internal reckoning, North Africa was about to experience a very direct, brutal, physical threat from the outside. I mean, you can't debate theology with an incoming artillery shell.
Yeah, you cannot.
You need societal resilience on a massive scale.
Which brings us to the organizational genius of the Sanusiyyah movement. Because if Wahhab provided this spark of intellectual reform in the desert, the Grand Sanusi was the master architect who built a complete grassroots society capable of resisting an empire.
So let's examine the Grand Sanusi. Born Sayyid Mohammed bin Ali al-Sanusi in 1787 in Algeria,
Right.
the geopolitical landscape he grows up in is just fraught. He's disgusted by the corruption and misrule of the Ottoman governors who nominally control North Africa. But he's also watching with alarm as European powers, specifically the French, begin their physical encroachments into the region.
He's basically a man caught between internal imperial decay and external colonial aggression. And he spends years studying widely across Fez, Egypt, the Hijaz in Arabia. He immerses himself in various Sufi teachings, but he's a pragmatist. He's looking for a system that can actually fortify his people.
And he runs into a lot of friction, right?
Oh, everywhere he goes. He finds himself facing hostility from the established authorities. The conservative scholars in Mecca push back against his reforms. The authorities in Egypt are suspicious of him. And, well, returning to French-occupied Algeria is just out of the question.
So he makes a calculated geographic move that dictates the success of his entire movement. He relocates to Libya, specifically a remote area called Jagbub.
Yes.
And from a logistical standpoint, it's a brilliant play. The Ottoman Turks only really care about the coastal towns of Libya, so they leave the deep interior to the Bedouin tribes. So he gets a region completely free from immediate imperial interference.
But it's not just isolation for the sake of hiding. Jagbub was strategically positioned squarely on vital trade and pilgrimage routes.
Oh.
Yeah, it was the nexus connecting Northwest Africa through Egypt to Mecca, and it bisected the routes running deep south into the Sahara and the Sudan. He essentially positioned himself at the vital crossroads of African trade.
That is incredibly smart. So he starts building what he calls a crown of Sufi practice. And I want to push back on this a bit, or at least pause here, because the popular conception of Sufism often conjures very specific imagery for us today.
Sure.
We think of the whirling dervishes, the ecstatic trances, the rhythmic chanting, the total withdrawal from the physical world into spiritual asceticism.
Right.
Yet the source notes that the Grand Sanusi completely forbade these practices. Why strip the mysticism out of a mystical order?
Because he understood that passive mysticism is useless against an invading army.
Wow.
He believed that rhythmic bodily exertions, the dancing, the drum beating, the endless processions, they didn't equip a society for the grim realities of the 19th century. He saw that extreme asceticism often led to a lazy, leisurely life dependent on the charity of others.
Right. You can't build an independent state if your population is just begging for alms and spinning in circles.
Exactly. The Sanusi philosophy was a brilliant synthesis. It took the legalistic, highly rational tradition of the ulama, the orthodox scholars, and fused it with the intense spiritual devotion of Sufism.
But he redefined it.
He fundamentally redefined what devotion meant. He explicitly commanded his followers to engage in hard physical labor. He emphasized agriculture, masonry, and crucially, arms training.
Arms training.
Yes, devotion to God in the Sanusi order meant cultivating the land and being prepared to defend it.
It's the ultimate manifestation of pray and pass the ammunition.
Yeah.
But the real genius of the Sanusi movement wasn't just the philosophy, it was the infrastructure. The blueprint for this entire society was the Zawiya system. These are typically translated as lodges, but as the source details, that word completely fails to capture what they actually were.
Yeah, they were politico-economic master plans. The Sanusis would build these zawiyas precisely on old Greco-Roman ruins, brilliantly utilizing the ancient surviving infrastructure where water tables were accessible right along those crucial trade routes you mentioned earlier.
So let's break down how a Zawiya actually functioned on a daily basis, because it's mind-blowing. It was a mosque, certainly, but it was also a civil court designed to settle tribal disputes before they turned into blood feuds.
Right.
It was a school teaching not just theology, but mathematics and chemistry. It was a functioning farm that produced its own food. It was a guest house ensuring safe passage for merchants. And it served as a node in an intricate, secure postal system across the Sahara.
And the integration with the local population was completely seamless. The Sanusists didn't conquer the Bedouin tribes, they partnered with them.
Oh, that's a huge distinction.
It is. The local tribe would donate the land and the labor to build the lodge. And in return, the head of the Sanusiyyah Order would send a highly trained scholar to run it. This scholar acted as the spiritual guide, the judge, and the agricultural manager. But the property essentially belonged to the community.
They engineered a self-sustaining shadow state. They literally lifted the local Libyan population out of extreme poverty by securing the trade routes and maximizing agricultural output.
It's incredible.
It's a stunning historical proof that a movement rooted in spiritual reform can generate massive, tangible economic and infrastructural benefits. They created wealth, stability, and literacy in regions that the Ottoman Empire had completely written off as useless deserts.
But, that very success made them a target.
Of course.
As the order expanded south into the Sahara and the Sudan, setting up lodges and securing trade, they inevitably collided with the expanding frontiers of European imperialism. The French pushing from the west and south, the British from the east, and ultimately the Italians from the north.
And the Sanusists had deliberately tried to avoid direct conflict with European powers, right? Their entire project was focused on internal growth and self-sufficiency.
Right, they weren't looking for a fight.
But when Italy invaded Libya in 1911, the Sanusists were forced into a massive defensive war. Because they had spent decades building a disciplined, heavily armed, and deeply unified society, they were able to mount an incredible resistance.
Yeah, you see the emergence of legendary resistance leaders like Omar al-Mukhtar, who utilized the logistical network of the Zawiyas to wage a grueling, decades-long guerrilla war against the Italian forces fighting well into his 80s.
In his 80s?
Yeah, the Italians thought they were fighting simple nomads, but they were actually fighting a highly organized, resilient society.
And the suppression of that society was horrific. The source highlights a tragic climax in 1930 when the Italian fascist regime, realizing they couldn't break the spirit of the Sanusists on the battlefield alone, issued a royal decree. They explicitly confiscated all the properties, the lands, the schools, and the agricultural centers of the Sanusi lodges. They systematically tried to dismantle the economic and educational engine of the society.
And this brings up a really profound irony highlighted in our text. While the Italians were confiscating their schools and farms, European intellectuals back home, people like the French explorer Duveyrier and the renowned historian Arnold Toynbee, were writing books labeling the Sanusists as reactionary fanatics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they used terms like zealotism, claiming the movement was just a violent, regressive form of isolationism born out of an irrational fear of modernity.
I mean, that is a textbook case of colonial projection right there. The actual historical record, as our source proves, shows the exact opposite.
Completely.
The Sanusists were highly constructive. They were remarkably tolerant of other Sufi orders. They maintained peaceful, lucrative trade networks for decades. They taught modern sciences alongside religion. They only resorted to violence when a foreign army literally landed on their shores and started taking their land.
The imperial powers basically demonized the indigenous resistance to justify the destruction of a society that was, in many ways, more unified and economically functional than the colonial administration that replaced it.
So we've seen the Sanusists fighting very physical, brutal battles in the deserts of North Africa to protect their physical infrastructure.
Right.
But during this exact same time period, another figure is realizing that the war isn't just about land or trade routes. The war is ideological. It's about the psychological architecture of the society.
Yes. While the Sanusists are building farms and mounting guerrilla raids, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani is building arguments and mounting global ideological offensives.
The source describes Afghani with a phrase that I absolutely love. It calls him a wild man of genius.
This is so fitting.
He lived from 1838 to 1897. If the Grand Sanusi rooted himself deep in the Libyan desert, Afghani was a relentless, charismatic wanderer. I mean, we are talking about a man who agitated in Afghanistan, India, Egypt, Paris, London, Russia, and Turkey. He was a global force.
He was. And Afghani possessed a profound sociological insight. He understood that Western imperialism was not just a military endeavor, it was an ideological virus.
Oh, an ideological virus.
Yes, he saw that colonial powers were actively trying to dismantle the moral and psychological foundations of Eastern societies to make them more compliant.
And one of the prime examples the source gives of this is his famous treatise, The Refutation of the Materialists.
Right.
He wrote this well before materialistic philosophies had gained massive mainstream traction in Europe. He foresaw the trajectory. Materialism, the philosophical belief that only physical matter exists, that there's no spiritual reality, and that moral values are essentially illusions, was, in Afghani's view, a societal poison.
He argued that if a society fully embraces materialism, it destroys the moral fabric and the sense of transcendent duty necessary to resist oppression.
Right.
If nothing matters beyond physical comfort and material survival, why would you ever risk your life to fight against a tyrant or a colonizing army? Materialism breeds a populace that is easily bought and easily subjugated.
But he didn't just critique Western philosophy. Here's where it gets really interesting. What makes Afghani so fascinating is that he turned that exact same intense critical lens inward.
Yes, he did.
He looked at the internal theology of the Islamic world and identified a rot that was just as dangerous as Western materialism. He launched a massive, blistering attack on the concept of al-Jad.
Right. Al-Jad is the doctrine of absolute fatalism.
Okay.
It's the belief that every single event, every human action, and every outcome is entirely predetermined by God, and therefore, human beings possess zero free will or agency.
So whatever happens to you, good or bad, is strictly God's will, and your only duty is to passively accept it.
Exactly.
And it is incredibly easy to see how a doctrine like that gets weaponized. If you're a corrupt sultan or an oppressive colonial governor, fatalism is the greatest gift you could ever receive.
Oh, absolutely.
You just tell the populace, God willed me to be your ruler. God willed you to be poor, starving, and subjugated. If you rebel against me, you're not just committing treason, you're rebelling against the will of the universe. It's a theology perfectly designed to enforce submission.
And Afghani tore that theological construct apart. He argued that absolute fatalism was an evil innovation, a bid'ah. It was not authentic to the foundational texts.
Really?
Yeah, he argued it had been maliciously introduced and perpetuated by centuries of corrupt rulers, specifically to keep the masses docile.
Wow. So he counterproposed a return to al-Qadar, which is a much more complex and demanding understanding of predestination. How does this differ from fatalism?
Well, al-Qadar, as Afghani interpreted it for the modern struggle, acknowledges that while God possesses ultimate knowledge of outcomes, human beings are endowed with real agency and a profound moral duty to act.
Okay, so there is agency?
Yes. It's the belief that God decrees the laws of the universe, but you must operate within them with courage and endurance. If an army invades your land, God has not decreed that you must surrender.
Right.
God has decreed that you must have the moral stamina to fight for justice, regardless of the odds. It transforms theology from a tool of submission into a mandate for action.
And that mandate for action fed directly into his massive political project, Pan-Islamism. Afghani traveled the world, and he realized a very dark, hypocritical truth about European colonization.
What's fascinating here is that the European states utilized a highly effective rhetorical game. They would justify their brutal colonial expansion by citing the backwardness, the corruption, and the stagnation of the Eastern nations.
Right, the whole "we're bringing you civilization" argument.
Exactly. They claimed they were bringing the light of civilization. Yet, according to our source, the moment any of those Eastern nations attempted to internally reform, modernize their institutions, or build a strong independent state, those same European powers would actively sabotage them.
Of course.
Often through direct military intervention or crippling economic sanctions.
It was a rigged game. You're colonized because you're weak, but if you try to get strong, we'll crush you.
Precisely.
Afghani saw this clearly, and he concluded that individual nations acting alone could never survive this machine. His solution was a great defensive alliance, a political and cultural unity of all Muslim peoples to act as a counterweight to European imperialism.
To propagate this, he and his student, who we'll discuss shortly, founded a highly influential political journal in Paris called al-Wahhab,
Okay.
which translates to the indissoluble link. It was a political weekly explicitly dedicated to arousing the global Muslim consciousness against Western exploitation.
And it was terrifying to the colonial powers. The British Empire banned it in Egypt and India almost immediately, which tells you exactly how potent Afghani's arguments were. He wasn't just a political organizer, he was an intellectual heavyweight capable of sparring with the best minds of Europe on their own turf. The source highlights his legendary 1883 debate in Paris with the illustrious French historian and intellectual Ernest Renan on the topic of Islam and science.
Right. Renan had argued that Islam was inherently hostile to scientific inquiry and rational thought. Afghani's response was a masterstroke of historical analysis.
What did he say?
He acknowledged the current state of scientific stagnation in the Islamic world, but he brilliantly separated the religion itself from the historical and political factors that had caused the decline, pointing out that the Islamic world had been the vanguard of science while Europe was in the Dark Ages.
But beyond the high-level debates on science, Afghani was acutely aware of the psychological warfare happening on the ground level of colonization. He passionately warned against a very specific tactic used by the colonizers to break the spirit of the colonized.
Yes, he did.
Let's really think about the mechanics of this. If an occupying power wants to ensure permanent control, physical force is expensive and exhausting. It's much more efficient to make the subjugated people police themselves by destroying their self-worth.
Afghani explicitly pointed out that the Occidental powers systematically tried to persuade Orientals that their history contained no glory, that their native languages were primitive and incapable of expressing complex modern thoughts.
That's insidious.
It is. And that true culture, true intellect, could only be accessed by abandoning their own heritage and adopting a European language and European customs.
It's the systemic erasure of identity. If you strip a people of their pride in their past, you strip them of the psychological fuel they need to fight for their future.
Exactly.
Afghani argued, there cannot be a sense of being one community in a people who do not have their own language. There can be no glory for a people who have no history of their own. He recognized that cultural preservation wasn't mere nostalgia, it was the absolute prerequisite for political freedom.
Yet despite all of this visionary brilliance, Afghani remained a spark. A French writer aptly called him a fisher of souls.
A fisher of souls, yeah.
He was a man who agitated, inspired, disrupted, and then moved on. He was constantly expelled by nervous monarchs and colonial administrators who found his presence too destabilizing.
Right.
He ultimately died under what was essentially house arrest in Istanbul. He generated the revolutionary fire, but he lacked the temperament to build the institutional furnace to contain it.
He needed someone who could take that raw, explosive energy and engineer it into lasting, methodical reform. And that transition brings us to our final major figure, the man who was perhaps Afghani's greatest student, ʿAbd. If Afghani was the global agitator, ʿAbd was the pragmatic institutionalist.
The contrast between their approaches is just fascinating. ʿAbd was born in 1849 to a modest Egyptian peasant family. He goes to study at the revered Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the oldest and most prestigious center of Islamic learning in the world.
Okay.
But he arrives there and is completely disillusioned by what he finds.
The educational system was exactly what Wahhab had been complaining about a century earlier in Arabia.
Exactly.
The source describes a mind-numbing process of rote memorization. Students spent years memorizing centuries-old commentaries on commentaries, debating obscure grammatical rules without ever engaging with the actual substance or meaning of the text.
It was so intellectually barren that ʿAbd actually considered abandoning his studies entirely to retreat into ascetic isolation.
But he's saved from that intellectual despair, first by a wise uncle who reintroduces him to a more vital ethical understanding of faith, and then completely transformed by meeting Jamal al-Din al-Afghani.
Afghani essentially rewires ʿAbd's brain. He introduces him to classical philosophy, modern science, and European political thought, showing him that these are not enemies of the faith, but essential tools for engaging with the modern world.
And ʿAbd becomes Afghani's most ardent disciple.
He does. He gets deeply swept up in Afghani's revolutionary fervor. In fact, ʿAbd becomes heavily involved in the Urabi revolt in Egypt in 1879.
What was the Urabi revolt?
It was a massive nationalist uprising against the corrupt Turco-Circassian ruling elite and the increasing, suffocating influence of British and French financial control over Egypt.
Right, because the British were protecting their interests in the Suez Canal, and they ultimately crushed the revolt in 1882, and ʿAbd is sent into exile.
Yes.
He joins Afghani in Paris, and they run the al-Wahhab journal together. But it's in the aftermath of this failed revolution that ʿAbd experiences a profound ideological divergence from his master.
Abdu analyzes the failure of the Arabi revolt,
Yeah.
and he looks at Afghani's relentless, wandering agitation, which, always seemed to end in exile or imprisonment. And Abdu comes to a structural realization.
Which is,
Political revolution from the top down, forcing change through immediate political upheaval, is ultimately futile if the underlying society is still mired in ignorance and stagnation.
oh, that makes sense. You can overthrow the ruler, but if the population hasn't changed, you just get a new ruler operating on the exact same broken system. Abdu realizes that true, lasting change requires gradual, methodical, educational reform from the bottom up. You have to change how the society thinks before you can change how it's governed.
So he splits from Afghani's purely political focus. He eventually returns to Egypt, but not as a revolutionary firebrand. He integrates into the system, he becomes a judge, and eventually rises to the position of Grand Mufti, the highest official of religious law in Egypt.
This shift from revolutionary to institutional reformer is profound. As Grand Mufti, he's now in charge of the very legal system that he knows is broken. But he doesn't try to tear the courthouse down. He uses his authority to subtly rewrite the operating rules.
Yes.
He begins issuing a series of incredibly pragmatic fatwas, legal rulings that demonstrate how ancient law can actually adapt to the modern world. Let's look closely at the mechanics of these fatwas, because they are brilliant examples of applied ijtihad.
One of his most controversial rulings dealt with the modern economy. He issued a fatwa stating that Muslims were permitted to receive interest and dividends from investments, like the postal savings banks.
That was massive, because the traditional strict interpretation of Islamic law forbade riba, which was understood as any form of interest, equating it to usury.
Right.
But Abdu recognized the economic reality of the 20th century. If Muslims completely boycott the banking system and refuse to earn dividends on investments, they will be economically marginalized and structurally weakened in a global capitalist system.
He used critical reasoning to differentiate between exploitative usury and necessary financial investment.
He also issued a fatwa ruling that Muslims could eat meat slaughtered by non-Muslims, specifically Christians and Jews. On the surface, this sounds like a minor dietary rule, but structurally, it's a massive social barrier breaker.
That's so.
It meant Muslims could dine in European homes, attend international banquets, and integrate into global diplomatic and social circles without the intense friction of dietary segregation.
Oh, wow, yeah, that's a huge shift in social mobility. And he even issued a ruling that Muslims could wear non-traditional clothing, like European-style hats with brims, if their profession or the climate required it.
The brimmed hats. Traditionalists hated this.
Oh, they despised it. They viewed the brimmed hat as a symbol of the European infidel because it prevented the forehead from touching the ground during prayer.
And what did Abdu say?
He said essentially, take the hat off when you pray. The fabric on your head does not dictate the purity of your soul.
To the rigid conservatives at Al-Azhar, these rulings looked like a capitulation to the West, a slow dilution of the faith. But to Abdu, this was the absolute essence of his mission, using human reason to extract the eternal spirit of the law and apply it to new, unprecedented realities.
And this brings us to the deep philosophical engine driving Abdu's entire worldview. He didn't just invent these pragmatic rulings out of thin air. He anchored them in a profound theological argument. Abdu reached back centuries to revive a highly rationalist strain of Islamic thought known as Mu'tazilism.
Okay, this is where we hit one of the most important fundamental questions in religious philosophy, a debate that essentially dictates how a society interacts with the concept of truth.
This raises an important question. If God decrees what is good, can God arbitrarily make good into evil?
Right. Like, if God suddenly commanded that lying and murder were virtues, would lying and murder inherently become good simply because God decreed it?
Well, the orthodox, conservative theologians of his time following the Asherite school essentially answered yes.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they argued that concepts like good and evil do not exist independently in nature. They aren't inherent in the actions themselves. They are completely dependent on God's arbitrary decree.
Okay.
If God changed the rules tomorrow, injustice would become justice. Human reason, therefore, is useless in determining morality. You can only know what is good by strictly reading what is commanded in the text.
Abdu viewed this as a catastrophic philosophical error. He vehemently rejected the Asherite position. He argued that if you believe morality is entirely arbitrary, you completely destroy the foundation of human reason, scientific inquiry, and personal moral responsibility. It reduces the creator of the universe to an unpredictable tyrant whose laws have no underlying rational architecture.
Abdu argued that beauty, the Arabic term is husn and good, are objective realities universally recognizable by human reason and common sense. He asserted that a human being could arrive at a completely natural, robust morality simply by observing the world and using their intellect, even without any exposure to religious dogma. We know intuitively through reason that justice builds a society and cruelty destroys it.
So what then is the purpose of religion if reason can figure it all out? For ʿAbd, religion does not create the good out of a void. Religion comes to reinforce what human reason already knows to be good. It provides a supreme moral imperative to back up logical conclusions, and it serves as a guide for the great mass of humanity who might not have the time or training to be philosophers.
This is a monumental shift. It elevates human reason to a sacred status. It explicitly states that you do not have to turn off your brain, ignore science, or abandon logic to be a devout believer. In fact, applying reason is a religious duty.
And he took this rationalist approach and applied it directly to his tafsir, his massive exegesis and commentary on the Quran. He revolutionized the field.
He really did.
Because for centuries, commentators had obsessed over linguistic trivia, or they'd invent massive, highly speculative folktales to fill in the narrative gaps of the text.
The source gives a great example of this. If a Quranic verse mentioned a village that the Israelites entered, traditional commentators would write pages upon pages arguing over the exact historical name of the village, who founded it, and what the weather was like.
ʿAbd had absolutely zero patience for that. He argued that it was completely irrelevant to the purpose of the text. He said, God will not ask us on the day of judgment what people may have said or understood, but he will ask us if we ourselves have understood his book and followed its direction. He stripped away the folklore.
When the text mentions the Kawthar, which traditionalists literalize as a specific physical river flowing in paradise, ʿAbd applied his rationalist lens. He interpreted it metaphorically, defining it as the great abundant gift of prophecy and spiritual insight.
He constantly pushed the focus away from literalist obsession and toward the underlying moral and ethical guidance, making the ancient text a living, breathing document capable of answering contemporary dilemmas.
ʿAbd dies in 1905, in the midst of this massive project of institutional and intellectual reform. But what is the actual legacy of a man who spends his life trying to inject this level of intense rationalism back into a deeply traditional system?
So what does this all mean?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, his impact is monumental. But because his thought was so complex and balanced so many inherent tensions between tradition and modernity, revelation and reason, his legacy splintered.
Splintered how?
His students took his foundational ideas and evolved them in three incredibly distinct directions, creating three branches of what is known as the School of ʿAbd.
Let's trace those branches because they perfectly illustrate how a single philosophical reboot can alter the trajectory of an entire culture in multiple ways. First, you have the social school, championed by a man named Qasim Amin. Amin takes ʿAbd's focus on reason and social progress and aims it directly at one specific issue: the status of women in society.
Amin becomes essentially the founding father of Egyptian feminism. He publishes explosive books arguing that the widespread degradation, seclusion, and ignorance of women in the Islamic world was not a product of original Islam.
What did he say it was?
He argued it was a symptom of the subsequent centuries of cultural corruption and the adoption of oppressive customs from conquered empires.
He used ʿAbd's rationalist framework to make highly controversial arguments. For example, he tackled the issue of polygamy. Traditionalists defended it as an absolute right. Amin argued that while the Quran historically permitted polygamy, the incredibly strict conditions it placed on the practice demanding absolute, impossible equality among wives were actually a legal mechanism designed to point society toward an ultimate ideal of monogamy. He argued, logically, that you cannot build a modern, functioning, scientifically capable society if you deliberately keep half of your population locked in ignorance and domestic servitude.
And then you have a very different trajectory with the religious school, led by Muhammad Rashid Rida. Rida was deeply devoted to ʿAbd, but he was operating in a slightly later context, reacting to the aggressive, increasing secularization coming from the West.
He was terrified that the Islamic identity would be completely dissolved by European culture.
Exactly. So he takes ʿAbd's call to return to the sources and interprets it much more rigidly. He founds a highly influential journal called Al-Manar to propagate his views. Rida turns ʿAbd's thought into a much more conservative, pan-Islamist, and anti-nationalist ideology.
Rida's trajectory is crucial because it shows how the initial spark of reform, the call to bypass medieval tradition and look at the original texts can be adapted into a stricter, more orthodox framework that's highly suspicious of Western cultural imports.
Laying the intellectual groundwork for various modern Islamist movements.
Yes. And finally, you have the philosophical school, represented by Mustafa Abdel-Razik. He embodies Abdu's desire to merge Islamic thought with modern academic rigor.
Abd al-Razik doesn't just study at Al-Azhar, he travels to France. He studies at the Sorbonne and actually studies sociology under the famous French sociologist Émile Durkheim.
He returns to Egypt and brings Abdu's ideas directly into the modern university system. He works systematically to synthesize classical Islamic jurisprudence with modern Western sociology and philosophy, trying to create an academic language that bridges both worlds.
Three completely different paths: social feminism, conservative pan-Islamism, and academic synthesis.
And all sprouting from the exact same attempt by Muhammad Abdu to balance the scales of tradition and reason.
It just highlights the sheer intellectual fertility of this period.
It's been a phenomenal arc we've covered today. We started in the harsh, isolated deserts of 18th century Arabia. We saw Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab initiate a radical, highly disruptive theological reboot, violently scrubbing away centuries of intellectual rust and demanding a return to the original source code through independent reasoning.
We then moved to the logistical and organizational genius of the Sanusiyyahs in Libya. They proved that spiritual reform isn't just about theology. It can be the engine for building a resilient, economically robust grassroots society capable of holding off fascist imperial armies for decades.
We followed the explosive, global anti-imperialism of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who recognized that the battle wasn't just for territory, but for the psychological and cultural soul of the East. He fought to give his people the intellectual armor they needed to resist the erasure of their history.
And we ended in the courts of Egypt with the pragmatic, rational institutionalism of Muhammad Abdu, who painstakingly demonstrated that true resilience does not come from rejecting the modern world, but from using the God-given faculty of reason to apply the eternal truths of your tradition to the rapidly shifting realities of the present.
Despite their vast differences in methodology, one utilized tribal alliances and mass literacy, one utilized fortified agricultural lodges, one utilized global political agitation, and one utilized pragmatic legal fatwas. They all shared one core, unshakable belief.
Yes.
To move forward, to survive an existential threat that threatens to erase your identity, you cannot just passively accept the decay of the present, and you cannot blindly, mindlessly imitate the past. You have to actively engage in the hard work of reasoning.
And this is the direct, vital takeaway for you listening today. The historical specifics have changed, sure, but the structural dynamics have not. We are facing our own versions of imperial encroachment.
Whether it's the overwhelming, destabilizing flood of new technological paradigms,
The homogenization of global culture, driven by algorithms,
or the rapid dissolution of the communities that used to anchor us. When faced with these massive, terrifying shifts, human instinct almost always drives us toward a binary choice. It's fight or flight.
Exactly. Either you retreat into a bunker of blind tradition, rejecting every new advancement as inherently evil and isolating yourself from the world, or you wholesale abandon your foundational identity and just assimilate into whatever the loudest, newest trend happens to be.
What these historical figures demonstrate so powerfully is a third way. True resilience, true survival, comes from independent, critical reasoning. It requires the incredibly hard, daily work of synthesizing the very best, the most rational parts of your foundational values with the undeniable realities of the present moment.
It means being confident enough in the deep roots of your identity that you aren't afraid to adapt the branches to survive a changing climate.
You don't survive by freezing time, and you don't survive by erasing your past. You survive by carrying the core of your past forward using reason as your compass.
Beautifully said.
Which leaves us with a final lingering question. Something to mull over long after this deep dive is finished. We're so heavily conditioned, especially today, to equate the concept of modernity strictly with westernization or with secularization. We just assume that progress, by definition, is something that has to be imported from the outside to fix a backward tradition.
But based on the lives, the struggles, and the profound intellectual leaps of the thinkers we have explored today, what if true modernity isn't something that can be imported at all?
What if the most radical, progressive leaps forward a society can possibly make can only be generated from within its own culture? What if the solutions to our most terrifying modern crises are actually hiding inside our most ancient texts, just waiting for a bold enough mind to strip away the rest of history and read them in a completely new way? The history we explored today was incredibly muddy. But if you have the courage to apply reason to the mud, you might just find the solid ground you need to stand on.